Hi everyone, welcome to the Aware, Relaxed, Connected podcast. Join me as we explore approaches and orientations towards cultivating the physical body, the internal landscapes, the mind, and our relationship with reality as a whole. I'm your host, Craig Mallet. Hello everyone and welcome back to the podcast. This week I have my friend Ramon Castellanos on. Ramon is a long-term cultivator. He's actually got a really super interesting and diverse history of various cultivation practices. And he is going to talk us through some of those. Before we get into that, though, I'd just like to remind you that my Patreon is up and running. And if you like the podcast and are enjoying the guests and the content of the podcast, it will really help if you jump onto Patreon and support. There are a bunch of tiers available. The first tier is basically just the, let me buy your coffee tier. And in return, you'll get early access to the podcast and articles and a few other bits and pieces like that. From tier 2 and up, which is the fire tier and beyond, every single one of those members gets a practice of the week every week, as long as I don't get caught up doing other things. But generally it comes out on Monday. It'll be like a half-hour practice, somewhere between 25 and 40 minutes, something like that. And we will be moving through lots of different topics. And this practice of the week is seasonal, which means we are going to be using the practices in harmony with the Southern Hemisphere seasons, at least where I live. And so we move through a lot of really interesting topics, from deep meditation to breathing to quite dynamic bodily practices that we'll get into in the summer. So if you'd like to have a practice and you don't know what to do, get on the Patreon, jump on at least tier 2, and you will get a practice every single week. And that value is absolutely stupidly ridiculous. It ends up being 18 Australian dollars per month for like 4 practices every single month, which is a bit probably underpriced for what it is, but whatever. I want this stuff to be accessible to as many people as possible. The tiers above that get bonus practices, they get discounts on things and so on. You can jump on Patreon and read all about that. So yes, if you'd like to support me, please head on to patreon.com/aware relaxed connected and join one of the membership tiers. And I will be forever grateful for everyone who does that, because you keep all my work afloat. Without further ado, we will get into the meat of the podcast now, and here it is. All right, I have my very good friend Ramon here with me. He is a long-time cultivator like myself and has been down many weird and wonderful paths. And we were talking the other week, and I came to the realization that he's one of the few people in the world who's on like almost the same page as me, with ideas and orientations and how we approach this stuff. But he's got a vastly different way of getting there, a vastly different history to me, including working in a wolf sanctuary for some time. So without further ado, here's Ramon, and maybe we can just start with a basic intro, so the people who've never heard of you and don't know your stuff know a bit about you, and feel free to plug your books and stuff.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be here, man. It's always funny trying to like put your life history or your context into like an introduction. I'm giving my best shot.
So you have 10 minutes, go.
So I was born and raised in a tradition that emerged probably in late Paleolithic Africa, and traveled to the Caribbean with the slave trade. And in the Caribbean, right, in Cuba specifically, it took root there and it grew and it changed somewhat from its African roots, but something beautiful and rooted in those African shamanic practices emerged there. And my family, being Cuban, was fully devoted to that tradition. And so I was raised in that tradition, initiated into it at a really young age, and grew up with my grandmother being a full time magical practitioner. who was working for people in a lot of different contexts. And she started training me in magic at a really early age, you know? And so I was exposed to that type of orientation, that animist way of approaching the world and making sense of the world from literally being an infant, right?
Mm,
It's just the water that I swam in growing up. And I mean, of course, so still in Western civilization. And so whether or not I realized that there was also the what you might call the dissonance or the static that's created by Western civilization occurring underneath that, which I had to face later on in my journey. But when I turned about 16 or 17, as most teenagers do, I decided to revolt against the traditions that I was born in. And I decided I was not going to practice these African traditions anymore. And I started to get into meditation and internal alchemy work. I was working at the time with Zen meditation, some of like Osho's really cathartic meditations, and which we really wouldn't call it a meditation, but his really cathartic practices. They were really expressive and intense and all about getting emotion out. And I was also at the time working with the microcosmic orbit, right? And I was doing it really incorrectly because I had learned how to do it from a really crappy CD. And I had no context for what was going on, right? I was some teenager, just started grabbing whatever was flinging out to me and started doing it. And inadvertently, somehow, I caused or I stepped into some sort of karmic pattern, I don't know, uh, a very premature and very, very, very intense Kundalini Shakti energetical awakening that hit my system like a lightning bolt. There's different people have different terms for what those things even are, right? People have different understandings for what those things even are. At this stage, I wouldn't argue with somebody and say that it was XYZ. All I know is that it hit me like a lightning bolt and
okay.
felt really energy just
What's that experience like? Like, what are you feeling? What's your day like when that's going through? Right?
That's a
That
great
might be
question.
better to help people understand it, right, than give it a random word.
Yeah, sure. Well, so initially it emerged when I was sitting down on a meditation cushion watching a wall, right? So that was the type of meditation I was doing, which was you keep your eyes kind of slightly open while facing a wall, right? And uh, something started to shake my spine. So it felt almost electrical. And it's not like a little bit of shaking, it was like super intense shaking. And so much so that it probably lasted about 2 to 3 minutes. And it was almost like an epileptic seizure. And it threw me off like my meditation cushion. So, like, when I was done, I was like laying on the ground and feeling hot, electrical, disturbed, bothered, and I really kind of had no idea what had happened. And then after that, I was just feeling super off, and just things were just wrong, and I just couldn't settle in my skin. And this lasted for weeks, and so I was trying to find a solution to this, and that period of time was really hazy, to be honest. That first few weeks, so I started doing Osho's cathartic meditation on top of that, right? Like after like a couple of weeks of just being totally off and just trying to like, get this out of my system. And that's when I woke up another layer of whatever that was, which felt like a really hot but also sexual type of energy just shoot out of my pelvis into my body. Which felt great and blissful. And then in the following days, the shit hit the fan, as it were, right? Like I would literally spend every day 4 to 5 hours a day crying. It would just hit me like these enormous episodes of just crying and crying and crying and having it just feeling like I couldn't function. Like, I literally could not function. I was in college at the time. I was in pre med, and I had a 4.0 GPO and everything. I loved pre med, right? And I had to drop out of college. I could not be in class. I would see people's auras all over the place, and I mean, it was just so disruptive. I would have these intense experiential understandings of the way that energy flowed in the universe and past life things, and it's just all sorts of things. What how much of that was actually accurate, I don't know, but that was the experience,
Mhm.
right? Um, Also just feeling just off. I mean, just totally like something is utterly off. Like you can't settle down. You can't be in your skin. You can't just be okay. It's just constant pressure and intensity. And I mean, it was so utterly disorientating. And that was my reality at that intensity, probably for like 6 or 7 months, something like that. Um, oh yeah, it was brutal. It started to kind of calm down probably a little bit around that time. Um, and by calm down, I mean I was able to start actually functioning in the world again, right? With effort.
Mhm.
Um, in some ways too, like I experienced a really intense disassociation. And that disassociation was characterized by not really being able to accept that the world around me was actually real. It was almost as if it was all just an illusion, right? Just
Mhm.
everything around me was some kind of illusion. And I had to slowly, and I mean over like a period of about a year, something like that. Exact time frames I'm a little fuzzy about, right? That's what it feels like. Re like humble myself into relearning how to function in the world, accepting that it was real, in a different way. It was like layers and layers and layers of relearning how to be in the world. Um, yeah, and so that was about like the first year and a half. Um, I ended up then moving with my wife at the time, which I did have. Me and my wife got married, even though I was going through all that. In that second year, in that that year period of me relearning how to be in the world. Um, and we moved to New Mexico, right? And then a few years after that is when I joined the wolf sanctuary and spent a decade out there. Um, and then it all calmed down a lot, right? It stabilized a lot, especially being in nature. It helped chill things out.
Mhm.
When I turned about 24, 25, I activated another episode, but not nearly as psychically disruptive, more like an energetic, a sudden massive increase in energy in my system again. And that set off a whole new, I guess, decade of like where I'm at now, I would say, in terms of cultivation. Um, yeah. And when I was about 28, more or less, I started getting back into the African traditions that I grew up in to try to understand them from a different place. I started working with teachers that were initiated by African elders. And that's when I got really, really deep into magic as an adult after having spent about a decade of not doing that type of work. And yeah, working with other teachers who had been trained in India and in Tibet. And yeah, just that's how I guess I've gotten to where I'm at in terms of like my background. Trying to shorten it a little bit, but
Yeah.
that's those are the
So there are two things I want to dive into here with you, and maybe I'll let you choose the order of these. The first thing I want to talk about is like the animism magic, that whole side of things, because I'm pretty sure most of my audience are like barely know that world exists. And it's like this big world with its whole communities going on. And once you kind of like get into it, you're like, whoa, it's this whole thing and it's everywhere. And lots of people are doing it despite, the surface appearances of Western culture being way too apparently rational and logical to do such childish things, getting beyond that layer. It's like, there's something more to it than just that. So I want to talk about that. The other thing I want to get into is your experience in the wolf sanctuary, and in particular, in your one of your books, or since we've been speaking at some point, you've talked about this notion of like the wolves and the wolf dog and the dogs being like kind of three distinct categories that are very different from each other, and we can compare it a bit to like hunter gatherer pre, well, I don't want to say civilized, pre-industrial humans, um, versus like modern humans versus maybe what's coming in this kind of like hybrid sense of those two things. Um, yeah, so you pick a lane. Which one do you want to go down to? And we'll come back to the other.
Yeah, we could talk wolves and wolf dogs and dogs. That's the one that felt alive. I mean, I just literally finished writing a book. Um, maybe a few months ago. My wife's been editing it. About well, let's say that the wolf dog and the dog are the totem animals, so to speak,
Mhm,
of the book. They're the power animals of the book. And it goes into this whole theme, right? So, we can start off with wolves, right? Wolves
mhm,
are a wild canid. They are an animal that understands its place in the world through a wild context. It's built into its very structure genetically and behaviorally.
mhm,
So you can't really take a wolf and put it inside of a house and call it domesticated, which is something that you often hear people say in these types of situations. You might, because to give a little background, at the wolf sanctuary that we were working at, the main purpose that we had was to bring in animals that people tried to have as pets. So
mhm,
wolves and wolf dogs that people tried to own as pets inside of a home that could not exist inside of a home. And so one of the things that we would often hear when we told people that mission statement was, oh, that means that they were domesticated if they were living inside of a house. And that's absolutely not the case. So, domestication is in and of itself a biological process that occurs over many generations and has particular features and traits. And it's actually at this stage in human evolution, we actually understand how to do that really, really, really well. It's a process that we have refined and it takes time, it takes generations. And the better that we get at it, the quicker we can do it to an animal. But predictably, when you start to domesticate, you start to alter how the animal will behave and how it even looks. And this is something that wolves have not gone through, but it is something that dogs have gone through. So, one of the ways to think about a dog is they are the wolves that came to live with humans because a dog is, or at least, the common dog that we know all around the world is, as far as we can tell, a domesticated gray wolf.
mhm.
And it's the same thing as taking a boar, a wild boar, and turning it into a farm pig. Same idea. And well, what's interesting about it is that even though they look really similar to the untrained eye, because of the trained eye, a wolf and a dog actually look really different. Behaviorally, they have some really stark differences. Right, so a wolf does not look to humans as its guide, as
Mhm,
its source of comfort, as its source of food, as somebody who's going to solve its problems. A wolf is its own being that can have possibly a relationship with humans under some conditions. Some wolves, under some conditions, can have a relationship with some humans. To be
almost
more
like
accurate.
if they feel like it, right?
Yeah, exactly. If they feel like it, if the conditions were conducive to something like that happening, etc. Right. So one of the things that we actually know about in Wolfland, right, and people who work with wolves is that you typically have to take them away from their mother and their father at about 10 days old, something
Mhm,
like that, before they open their eyes fully, and then proceed to spend the next 24 hours a day with them, literally 24 hours a day for months on end, typically,
mhm.
in order to give that wolf a good chance of wanting to be around some human beings.
Wow.
Uh, yeah. So, I mean, are there flukes? Are there exceptions? Of course, but as a rule, it takes a lot of work to make a wolf want to be around humans. Uh, a big part of that is because humans and wolves actually have a super long history. We have been engaging with the wolf in one context or another for a really long period of time. Some of that has been symbiotic. and some of it has been in competition because wolves have been hunting the same game as humans for a long period of time, and they hunt as a social animal in a pack structure as a cohesive unit, the same way we do. So uh, our hunter gatherer ancestors would learn from wolves, but then also we would kill them in all likelihood in a lot of situations because of um, certain competitive the nature of living in nature, right? And so wolves by their very nature, I've said nature too many times I think in the last couple of minutes, they tend to be wary of humans, right?
Yeah.
And so it takes a lot of socialization to get them to want to be around us. So wolves are pretty neophobic. They don't really like new things. They don't really like being around people. Fast movements scare them. They have a ton of energy. They want to be moving around all the time. They chew through walls, literally through walls. They eat furniture. It's a mess trying to have them in a house. Or you take a dog, on the other hand, dogs, they do look to humans to be our source of comfort, to be their source of comfort. They want us around. They give us love. We give them love. They protect us. There's an interesting study that's been done where you take a ball that is hard to get into and you put food in it and you give it to a wolf, and a wolf will just go at the ball for hours, literally just trying to get other food. You give it to a dog, the dog might mess with it for a few minutes and then it can't get into it. It starts to look to the human beings to try to, like, hey, can you solve this problem for me, right? The wolf doesn't. And dogs, they accept that we are there to guide their life, and most dogs are happier when we do, right? So in a lot of ways, this to me is a really good metaphor for human beings in terms of like the difference between wild hunter gatherers and those of us who live in modernity, right? The modern world is built around domestication. It not only has have certain institutions purposefully domesticated humans and are continuing to do so, or at least partly domesticated us. It's an in process thing that's occurring, but the 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 culture that we have relies on domestication to exist, right?
Mm.
Food, agriculture, farming, right? We require these things. We are a domestic culture. The primary religions that run modernity are the Abrahamic religions, and so of course you have you have places in which Western modern civilization has not yet encroached, and so those traditions are not expressed there yet. But the traditions of modern Western culture are the Abrahamic religions,
Mhm.
and they revolve around the domestic mythos overall, and the God created the world so that we can shepherd it. Basically, it's
Mhm.
for humans, so we can control it, we can take care of it, and it's for us to do what we will with it. And so, yeah, we have all of that. What's interesting is the wolf dog is an animal that is neither wolf and neither dog. And you can't actually ever really know when a wolf dog is born what its behavioral traits or its appearance is going to be. So you can take a pure wolf and a pure dog, mix them together, and you're not necessarily going to get some clean 50-50 split down the middle
Mhm.
where every animal is predictably a certain way. You might get some that are very wolf like, some that are very dog like, and some that are somewhere in between. And so an animal will take on some wolf qualities and some dog qualities, both in appearance and in behavior. And then something really interesting happens for some animals, which is they develop this third set of traits which cannot exist which let me not say cannot, but does not typically exist in either animal. And that is an animal that can often be as strong, as intelligent, as powerful, as clever as a wolf without the same inhibitions uh, that a wolf has towards humans because it has the fearlessness towards humans of the dog, for example. And so then you get animals that are really unpredictable. Wolf dogs are typically unpredictable animals. Wolves are pretty predictable. Dogs are pretty predictable. Wolf dogs, as a general rule, are unpredictable as a whole. In terms of, you get a litter, you don't know what they're going to do. And then some wolf dogs are just totally unpredictable in their behavior as a general thing. Um, and I think that for many humans today who are interested in what we would call them, rewilding, quote unquote, and these types of movements, and even people who are deep cultivators who start to connect into something deeper beyond the superficial layers of modernity, we start to behave something more like wolf dogs, right?
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
start we start to wake up these sort of unpredictable qualities, and we have more of an inherent wildness in terms of not being not being fully guided by the mission statements and agendas of the domestic. But then we also still have some domestic traits because we pay
Mm.
taxes, we live in homes, we buy at grocery stores, etc. Yeah. So is that what you were asking about? I guess
Yeah,
is that
yeah, yeah. So I mean, again, for the listeners who are tuning in here, and for those who don't know, right? Because I'm aware that my audience has like these little subcultures within it. Because I've had my feet in a bunch of different pies in my life. Um,
yeah.
that that there is something like a movement to return to things as they were amongst the rewilding communities. It's like we messed up. Let's rewind. Let's go back to where we came from. Let's and the essential thing is like we're dogs at the moment. Let's go back to being wolves, right? Let's get completely wild again. Live in this very wild way. Um, and then there's of course mainstream culture, which are just pretty happy being dependent little puppies that don't go anywhere. And another thing, part of this is like the emotional landscape, right? Well, I think was it you who was saying that like a dog puppy and a wolf puppy are pretty similar up until a certain age, and then they like fork off with after they kind of pass this maturing stage and they become completely different.
Yes. They are similar. I would say that a wolf is a little bit more energetic and intelligent, but overall the behavior is very similar. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So that the dog essentially stays kind of confined in this immaturity, right? I've got a lovely little dog who's the listeners won't be able to see this, but one can see it on the webcam. My little pooch here, he's like 8.5 years old and is still like a puppy at heart. It's just the best, but you know, I don't like his chances if he were to just be put out in a wild. He's on to survive, right? He's pretty much like a puppy still. He's got the maturity of a puppy and stuff, and that's what makes the dogs endearing to humans, right? They're so cute and cuddly and all the rest. And something similar happens to domestic humans from my view, that there's this like when we're not initiated into the wild and the dangers of the wild and yeah, everything that goes on in there, the harsh realities of the wild, so to speak, that we maintain that childishness, immaturity of some level, right? You can still go on and be a functional adult in domestic society, but put this person in a wild situation and there's a lot of shows about what happens when that happens, reality TV shows and things like that, right? All the grand ideas fall out the window and you get a blubbering mess of a 3-year-old again come out of nowhere. So it's like something gets trapped and confined um, in us, and there's this idea to get back to the wolf life where we're completely wild, independent humans. I was reading. I think it was there's a interesting book called Hunt Gather Parent, which this lady goes around to all these different um, hunter gatherer type communities that still exist, and she's in Africa somewhere, Tanzania maybe, with some tribal people, and the kids by like age 7 are all totally capable of finding their own food, building their own shelter, and essentially looking after themselves if they get lost in the wild, right? They kind of I they're way more mature way sooner than we are. Most of our adults couldn't even do that in domestic culture. And so there's this like movement to go back to that. But when you started talking of this wolf dog, like this hybrid thing that like struck a chord with me because I'm born and raised in a domestic culture, right? And I still have that, the trappings of that. The benefits of that is I can participate in society as well with little trouble, whereas like, someone raised completely wild being brought into a city is just going to be like, what the hell, how do I even do any of this? It doesn't make any sense, and I'm probably going to want to hightail it back to the wilderness. So I always had this view, and I know a bunch of my friends, people like Simon Thacker and a few other people that I'm going to get on the podcast, had this view of this like hybrid as well, where you have like the best of both worlds, bringing them together and wishing them together. And I think a lot of people are kind of moving towards that these days. And as you kind of pointed out, the observations of the wolf are really astute because the hybrid is really unpredictable. You never know how much of what comes and what's produced, and we seem to be in these circles, at least in this era of like extreme creativity, where it's not really clear where it's gonna go, but it's interesting, something's changing.
Totally, yeah. Yeah, so to touch on what you said, that's actually a feature of domestication is to have an animal retain its its juvenile traits its whole life.
Mhm,
It's called neoteny, uh, neotany. To neotenize an animal is to have it remain in perpetual adolescence, basically. And so I absolutely agree that a part of how that works in today's world is to keep humans at least partly in adolescence in terms of the development of the human animal, so to speak. And well, because the young of our species are easier to manage and easier to control.
mhm,
So if you think about like a baby bear or an adult bear, which
mhm.
one do you think you have a better chance of getting to do what you want?
Yeah.
Right? The baby bear. And so it's something that is also built into the Abrahamic traditions. There's this very paternalizing quality to them, right? The parental uh, parental projection onto the God force
Mhm,
in a way that keeps people infantile. It's a part of the process, and it's also the way the governments orientate, which is please take care of us, please give us the safety that we need, please do everything that we require so that we can stay safe. It is a very
mhm,
childlike way of orientating towards authority figures, right? So yeah, it is very interesting. At about the age of 2, a wolf starts to shift into adulthood, and it loses a lot of its puppy-like traits. It goes from being, "Yeah, let me play around with you," to, "I'm suddenly way more independent, way more in my own space. I'm not going to let you manhandle me and pick me up and throw me around anymore," which you can do to some wolf puppies. You typically can't do that to a wolf adult, even if you have a good relationship with the wolf adult. And things like that. The animal just goes in a very different direction. And sometimes it's really stark. And you don't know if you can't tell that animal A, puppy, is going to be who they're going to be when they turn into adult.
mhm,
It's almost like two different phases of life, like a caterpillar and a butterfly.
mhm,
It's really unique and interesting. And to touch on the other side of what you said, I personally, and some people might disagree with me, do not think it is possible for us modern humans who were raised within civilization to fully go back and rewild, in the sense of there's always going to be the fact that you were raised within the context of modernity. Your nervous system is just different. I mean, can you spend 30 years in the wilderness completely separate from everything and maybe undo a lot of that? Sure. But there's still going to be something, right?
yep,
Because your nervous system literally developed in this world. And so there's no fully going back for us. And so what I suspect is happening is that we are currently not fully domesticated. We are partially domesticated, and it depends on the person. It's not a perfect process. It's not like every human is 25% domesticated. Is that we are in the process of being domesticated, going through an actual definable process. We could literally say it has these qualities to it, and we can point them out in humans as much as we can point them out on a farm animal. And that something deep within is almost revolting against that process. It's it's rebelling against it. It's
Mhm.
almost having an immune response to it. And the way that I like to characterize it is a type of immune response to this process, and we're starting to cast off some of its effects. And at the same time, we are re-educating ourselves because a part of who someone is in some ways the education that they go through, right? And so in that process of re-educating ourselves and casting off this domestic virus in a way is what we're calling the rewilding movement, right? And so that's how I have come to understand it. It's a metaphor. I'm not saying it's literal, but that's the metaphor that makes the most sense to me. And I have seen plenty of people who have spent a long time in the wilderness and are still very domestic in other ways. Right?
Mhm.
You have a lot of sometimes elite soldiers who could go out in nature and survive and have spent a long time in the wilderness, and yet they're drinking the soup of the government, and the government loves me, and they're so stuck in certain domestic qualities that, I mean, you could say they have that hybrid type of quality to them, right? But
Mhm.
just being in nature and just practicing bushcraft and just doing all those things is not enough anyway. If someone really wanted to undo all of this,
Yeah.
because there are so many layers to it. As this could tie into animism too, right? When you look
Exactly where I wanted to go.
awesome, yeah. So when you look at the way a- and you feel the way and you experience the way that indigenous cultures relate to the world, there we have to recognize that there are purposeful that they are purposeful. I'm trying to find the best word for them, but it's something like a curse, or like a like a blockage, like a binding, something like that, uh, put into modernity that literally stifles our ability to connect to the world the way that indigenous people do.
Mhm.
Um, and that a part of what we would call rewilding, at least, rewilding the human animal, right, is being able to connect to reality the way that they do. Because almost universally, that's what you see is all indigenous people tend to have certain, I mean, obviously there's cultural differences, but there are certain underlying archetypal themes in the way that they experience reality. And it's not just like, oh, they sit at an altar and they have, a magical practice, right? It's not so like external. Those things can get us there. They can be tools to help us do that, but it's more about this lived and felt experience about being tuned into the world at a whole different bandwidth
Mhm.
than modern humans. And and the guiding authorities that include the church, but also, you know, we could lay them out if we needed to, right? But they have in fact magically built barriers to us being able to do that.
Yeah.
And so a part of what we have to kind of do if we want to connect into that is unweave some of those bindings and undo some of those curses, and actually be able to reconnect with the world in a more animate way. And that is a big, big layer of the rewilding process,
Yeah.
that is completely missing in a lot of circles that claim to want to be doing that. Right? You find people who are like, let's eat the Paleolithic diet and let's wear five finger shoes and let's let's sit on a squatty potty and let's do these things, and that's great. It's not me. at all, dismissing the value of those tools for the right person if it makes sense for them. But that is still steeped in a lot of ways in the domestic uh, vision of the world.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so the animistic vision of the world, and again, I'm going to do my best to spell this out like people haven't heard of it, right? Because I'm reasonably sure there'll be people listening that just don't even know what that really refers to, right? Animate, the word is like the same as animation means to bring something to life, right? Something that's living or alive. And so the animate vision of the world sees the world and everything, absolutely everything in it as living, um, as being able to relate to as if it were sentient, not because we're making believe that it's sentient, but because that's the direct experience, right? That's what it feels like. And so when the whole experience of reality is viewed as living, and I actually don't think this clashes with the Abrahamic traditions at a mystical level at all. There are like mystical versions of those traditions, like the Sufis, like the mystical Christians and the Gnostics and stuff like this, that
Correct.
I'm pretty sure see the world in the animate vision as well. And
Sure.
it's not too far from seeing everything as God, right? And God is inherently alive. And so it's like we can relate to all these different parts of the world as if they're living. And the main thing that does is it changes our behavior, right? It changes the way we relate to our day-to-day life. So if stuff isn't just inanimate, inert matter there for us to mold however we feel like, then we have to think twice about breaking a tree, about throwing something out because we don't want it anymore, you know? If and you see the animate vision alive in the domestic world all the time. People talk to their cars like they have personality, you know, their computers and their phones in the same way. And some of them almost do like have a palpable personality if they've been nurtured in the right way. Han Solo in Star Wars comes to mind. You know, he's got the Millennium Falcon, which is this ship where he's constantly talking to you, going, "Oh, come on, we can get through this. Let's do it. Oh, hold together, please. We'll make it." You know, and he's kind of negotiating with this ship, this spaceship at any point in time in the show, and that's a really nice example of the animate vision, right? It doesn't have to be all altars and Western occult pentagrammic circles and things like this. It's like it's a way we relate to the world. It's a way we relate to the world as the world being living. Um, and like I said, it's inherently relational. And the most interesting thing is it's inherently normative for humans. Josh Schrei has a great podcast called the Emerald Podcast. Ramon and I have talked about this quite a bit. But one of the episodes in particular is worth listening to if you've not heard of the animate thing. uh, it's titled Animism is Normative Consciousness. And the idea is that for however many hundreds of thousands of years humans existed, pretty much it's like less than 0.1% of humans that have existed don't believe in this animate thing. So it's abnormal. It is not normal to view the world in the rational mindset. And if you had, 10,000 people there and one person was like, this is all garbage, it's all just material, and all the rest are like, it's alive, then you start to be like, okay, maybe that's the abnormal one. So in the broad history of humanity, most humans, regardless of culture, regardless of location, regardless of anything except not belonging to an Abrahamic tradition, see the world as animate. And so it's like coming back to what's inherently within us, and we want to see the world as animate, and our shows point this out, like all the kids shows that have talking teacups and things like this, and all the movies that want to see the world as animate. It's a drive that's deep within all of us, and you can smother it down, or you can start to tease it out and bring it back through those layers of haziness that keep us disconnected from those things. So I just wanted to paint that picture a bit for the people listening, because that, as soon as you talk about the animate, especially from this level of curse that Ramon was talking about. There's like a part of us that's like, oh, that's all bad and evil and whatever. It kind of feels a bit uncomfortable somehow, right? And we start bringing to mind like shitty 80s movies of satanic rituals or whatever.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for laying the groundwork. I apologize for just jumping straight to curses. And but it's yeah, so I love how you were able to lay down a solid foundation. So uh, in my opinion, right, in my experience too, animism is what we call animism in the or because one of the interesting things about it, right, is that as Joshua Schwei pointed out in that podcast, that indigenous cultures typically don't even have a word for animism, right? It's
Mm,
just the water that they swim in, right? And the for me, what it is, it's as best as I can tell, is that everything is alive in a manner of speaking. It's because everything is consciousness, which is something that you find in a lot of Eastern traditions, but you could even see it in the Western tradition as everything is God, right? God being this consciousness, of course. And also, everything is breathing this animating breath that we would call the breath of life, which shows up in a lot of traditions too. And one of the meditative processes that I worked on for a lot of years very specifically connects into the breath of life and learns to feel it on a regular basis and learns to let it unfold you. And it's very interesting because I've had experiences where, and these have only happened a few times, that mirror the experiences of some of the spiritual osteopaths that worked a lot with the breath of life. That I've been standing in my room after a particularly deep period of meditation, and all of a sudden, everything around me is breathing. And I mean, it's as real as if I were on psychedelics, but I'm not on psychedelics. It's been as real as this TV, this computer in front of me. It was so palpable,
mhm,
and it was so immense that it was like, whoa, this is amazing. And it we just don't notice it because it's like the water that we're swimming in, right? It's everything is breathing this God breath in a way. And it's very interesting that a lot of people who are on certain types of psychedelics, one of the things they often notice is that things are breathing. It's
mm,
something I've heard so many people say. And that's because they are, and everything is, and we just don't notice it. And so this combination, and I mean probably other factors too, right? I'm just speaking about what I've been able to apprehend with my tiny little human brain is, that everything is consciousness and everything is breathing. And this is in many ways what we would think of as the core aspects of animism.
mm,
And yeah, animism then also opens you up into the idea that there are spiritual forces that exist outside of bodies that have autonomy
mm,
and can have causative power in the world. And and that those spiritual beings can exist within a context that is very diverse, everything ranging from very low vibration beings to very high vibration beings to organized structures that have what we could call communities of beings that are have agendas and are interfacing with humans in the physical form, and that you can even have beings that have opposite opposing agendas. And this is one of the places in which I would say that, yeah, the root of a lot of the Abrahamic traditions um do have some of these ideas, right? There is demons and angels, right? There's these
mhm,
different beings that have different agendas, and these then this start type of stuff tends to make the domesticating current, which is what I like to call the domesticating force, is the domesticating current, because I see it as a current of energy. Um, it makes them uncomfortable because they
mhm,
can't control it, because they can't quantify it, because they can't say, well, there, there's the 37 gods from this tradition that are all working together, and people can connect directly to them and have these experiences that we can't monitor and we can't control. And people are using power to direct, or working with these beings to direct the flow of power in the world, but alter the flow of events. And we can't monitor that. So they squash it down.
Yeah.
Right. And yeah. And as soon as you start to talk about those things, people go like, "Oh, well, what does that mean?" And I don't see these forces on a consistent basis. I don't interact with them on a consistent basis, and that's probably true because right now in Hong Kong, and some dirty, seedy basement at the bottom of a restaurant, there's a card game being played and people smoking cigarettes and drinking sake, right? Or whatever. And that's not our world, and we have no idea how the game is played, what the rules are, what the culture's like, none of those things. That doesn't mean it's not real, right? And so
Mm.
that's the same thing with the animate world. It's just because we're not engaging. Well, when I say the animate world, I mean all these different spiritual forces. Just because we're not engaging with them on a regular basis doesn't mean it's not there. And maybe that guy somewhere in Hong Kong makes a bad bet, right? And who knows how it alters his life, and he comes to Hawaii somewhere and he crashes into some car, because he's having a bad day, and then I have to redirect my detour. So I have to detour around him. So like that game may have affected my life in a way that's not completely obvious to me. And the same could be said about all these different spiritual forces that people are interacting with and have been interacting with for a long period of time. I mean, there's entire cultures that are having consistent, ongoing relationships to these certain spiritual forces that are giving them feedback about how to function in the world through divination, through direct experience. Like, what business do I grow? How do I engage with my business? What do I offer these people? Who do I marry? How do I treat my neighbor? All these things. So these spirits are directly altering what's happening inside of the physical world still. It's just that in modernity, it's just not very obvious, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Except when it is, right? So some examples of this, right? The spirit of a riot is a really good example I like to give, right? Because people get possessed by that spirit when there's a riot going on. People who wouldn't otherwise smash it and light it on fire and loot and all the rest end up doing stuff completely contrary to their individual personal nature. They get possessed by the spirit of the riot going through that
Mm,
place. And that spirit has a life and it has a lifespan, and at some point it finishes and, the riot disperses and all the rest, but it has still affected that and it still works as if it had its own mind, right? Um,
mhm,
and from this perspective, it does have its own mind. It is its own agent that has gotten a bunch of humans kind of caught up in it. And the same with big business, right? You think of a big business, as soon as a business is like publicly traded, there's a board of directors, and all those board of directors, every single person can change, and the business can still be seeking whatever the business is seeking. So there's like a big
mm,
spirit behind that business, a big animate, intelligent, inanimate force that typically wants to eat money. But, it's just like, give me more. I'll just, change the board of directors and get on a board that suits me better, and so on and so forth.
the
So
life.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So these things are seen as living, and even in the domestic world, they're treated as living because they're now entities that have their own. You can sue them and things like this, and not a single individual person is being sued, but you're still in court fighting a corporation that doesn't physically exist, right? It's just a conglomeration of actions at some point. Um, but yeah, yeah, it's got its own agency, it's got its own intelligence, it's got its own desires, it wants to go in a particular direction. So it's all around us anyway, is the point you're making, and sometimes being reminded of those more obvious examples, but there's subtle examples too of forests trying to take back their land very slowly and things like this.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, sometimes I forget about the more obvious examples like that to bring them up. So thank you for doing that. Yeah. Um,
I say them
yeah.
because I've come from that other side, right? I grew up in a in essentially an agnostic household. I mean, I don't think we did any religious, any nature, anything really like camping and fishing in a very domestic sense was about the limit of it. And so I came into a lot of these practices with the atheistic, rational mindset, and I had to have enough like experiences that just twisted my rational brain to non-comprehension until smoke blew out my ears, and that kind of defense let itself down until it started seeing this, and then it starts becoming obvious everywhere the more you look. But I've spent most of my life in cities and domestic locations, so my interaction with these living forces has been within the kind of city landscape. It's been very interesting to watch.
Yeah, well, that's super valuable to have that, right? Because a lot of us exist in that context.
Mhm.
Totally. So, I mean, and if animism is real, and I suspect that it is real, and so as you said, pretty much most humans ever
Yeah.
suspect that it's real. That means that it would still be occurring, in the context of a city.
Yeah.
Uh, it's just it's harder. I think it's less. I don't know. I guess depends on who you are. It seems easier for most of us to have experiences that reinforce the deeper animate sense of the world when we are engaging with things like a tree or flowing water,
Mhm.
or we're out in these kinds of settings, or when we're sitting at a shrine and speaking to a particular spirit, and all of a sudden our nervous system gets lit up like a Christmas tree or whatever, right? As opposed to, you know, uh, my computer, or my countertop, or any of these things, right? Not that those experiences can't be had. I tend to have a relationship with all my computers, and I talk to them. I want to make sure that we're on good terms with each other because we work together. A computer is literally an ally. How
Yeah.
much can you access through a computer that makes your life better? That wouldn't be there. I mean, obviously, the other side of that could be true for some people, but for me, typically, computers are generative.
Mhm.
They let me access information and allow me to do things that improve my life, generally speaking. So, to me, a computer is an ally, and so I tend to have that type of relationship with it. But there is something to be said about getting into the types of experiences that are so strong that they can move past the defense, as you said. And I love that you put it that way. I do think it is a defense, a type of defense mechanism. I mean, our brain is in some ways doing that anyway. So a one way to think about a brain is almost like a reducer. It's meant to
Yeah.
actually keep out as much as it's meant to help us interpret. In a way, the brain is meant to limit how much information we're getting at any one point in time, because there is so much information everywhere that at least within the context of how the human body is currently built, I mean, it would kill you if you were to access, a fraction of it, right? So the brain is very purposefully reducing how much you can access. And something like mushrooms, in terms of like a psychedelic, not that I'm recommending anyone do that per se. I'm just saying that, I have done it. And from direct experience, one of the things you notice is that it starts to loosen that up a little bit. So a
Yeah.
little bit more information starts to come in. Uh, if you take a lot of it, maybe more information than you can handle starts to come in. And that's where you start to potentially get some very nasty side effects. Um, but it is doing that. And so humans also are special modern humans, sorry. Modern humans are often especially closed down at a sensory level. So not only are we by default built to have a reducing uh, quality happening in terms of being in a body, but modern humans especially even more so. Their faculties are less tuned into environmental information flows, and not only environmental, but even inside.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? You can't even feel what's going on inside yourself, and not to mention the more subtle currents of energy that are occurring outside of you. Forget even and like subtle currents of energy. Most people don't even notice the physical things that are happening around them.
Yes.
I go like to the supermarket, and I for me, I'm immediately always caught by the flowers and the animals and the birds and the lizards, and what they're doing, and the type of conversations they're having, and where the sun is at, and what the wind is doing. All these things are, for me, like, generally speaking, a part of my experience. Obviously there's days where I'm a little shut down too, but that's like a big part of my experience. And I noticed that for a lot of people, they don't notice these things at all. They're
Mm,
just not even there. So then we start to talk about where, like, these powerful animate traditions come from, you know, like Taoism, or the Sanskrit culture and everything that they were able to build, and how refined their ability was to understand these really subtle forces, like the science of mantra, which is enormous, and is basically and it's basically this deep repository of sound, and how different sounds move throughout the system. A mantra has a pattern of of movement. And so when we're engaging certain mantras, some mantras, they squeeze energy into the central channel and shoot it up out of the head. And some, they do the opposite. Some mantras are expansive. Some create these toroidal undulating fields. Some create more energy that's sharp and moves back, or sharp and moves forward, or sharp and moves. There's all these different patterns. And these people were able to literally categorize that and teach us how to work with it as a cultivating vehicle. How did they do that?
yeah.
By being immensely, incredibly tuned in to subtle forces, uh, along with a lot of experimentation, obviously. But I mean, all they were able to feel and sense at that level, which is incredible. And the same thing with the Taoist arts, and all of the different things they were able to create. Right? It's like because they were tuned in and tuned out, right? So tuned into the world around them, and tuned into what was happening, and the interplay between these experiences. And the humans today are so far away from that. They're like, as like cultivators, we're trying to, like, unlock some of these faculties, and playing with the things that we were often handed through the generations, to try to make sense of our experience. And it's really quite fascinating. But so a big part of why animism is not very obvious and overt, in terms of, like, or let me not put it this way, why it isn't such a central feature of the life of modern people, is partly also because of this shutting down of our sense faculties,
Mm,
because we can't feel these things, right?
yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you when sometimes when the spirit when you communicate with the spirit, they alter the flow of energy in the body, but can you feel the
Mm,
alteration of the flow of energy in your body? Right? Do you know it's there? It's if you speak to a tree and it gives you a response, can you really feel that response? You know, and that's just those are just basic examples, right? That's like 101 getting into these things. Um, and a lot of people can't. And it's uh it's interesting. That's a part of the curse, right? And also, when I say curse, it goes back to that idea, this, like, core idea in magic, that there's different definitions of magic, but one of them is any any act or anything that causes change in accordance with the will, right?
mm,
And so when you look at the will of certain powers that be, certain authorities, they have purposefully created certain structures within the psychic environment of the modern world that shut us down, that block our capacity to sense at subtle levels, that tell us that those things don't exist, that they're not even real. I mean, science doesn't even acknowledge that there is a soul. So I mean, we live in a soulless society,
yeah.
and it's like the soul isn't a thing. right? I mean, even at that level, there is a purposeful, and it is purposeful. At least initially, it was purposeful. I'm not saying that every single person who upholds those beliefs is doing it purposefully, but initially there were these purposeful interjections of those beliefs and those attitudes to do these things to us.
Mm.
And uh, it's an interesting situation that we live in.
It is. So I want to tie the whole animacy back into the grounding aspect of things, right? And kind of tie it back to what you were talking about where you almost blew yourself up at the start of your life.
Oh,
And maybe I'll give a few examples and then let you go and talk about how you kind of countered that and reversed that. So in Taoist theory, you have this idea of yin and yang. I'm sure everyone's heard of that, right? The yang being something like the process of the energy, and the yin being something like the structure or material through which that process occurs. Something like this. It's way, way, way more complex than that, but that'll be a nice rudimentary way to start, right? And so what we're seeing today is people who have not been born, have not had their structural capacities of like their nervous system, their body, their internal cavities, their deep psychology prepared in the way to handle this amount of information, suddenly discovering practices in a book and going, I'll just do that. A practice inevitably brings a shit ton more information and energy and whatever you want to call it through this system that is not prepared to handle it. And you get this kind of byproduct of what's essentially like friction, right? It's like electricity moving through the world's crappiest circuitry, and it heats up and it starts sparking, and there's just too much energy for the structures that are supporting that energy, and you get all sorts of effects from that. What I've found in my training is that the more we actually spend time with this yin aspect, with this structural aspect, which is not just the physical structure of the body, but mainly that, but it's like the structure of life and the structure of how you conduct your day-to-day life and all of these things, actually preparing that to be able to handle more and more and more energy. If you don't do that, you'll end up in this chaotic mess very quickly, even if the things you're doing are real and invoking real things. But even worse, because it invites this energy and there's this like friction, it produces all this byproduct, right? And this byproduct gets confused for the actual thing. And so you end up with visuals and imagery and feelings you're assuming is the energy, but might just be like frictional rubbing force just pushing out sparks into your life in all sorts of ways. And if you were to do that thing with a nice prepared open system, it wouldn't at all be experienced like that. And probably the indigenous people who were like raised in circumstances that allowed their system to be naturally structured and naturally open would do the same thing and not at all experience it with the fireworks we do, right? It's usually a kind of calmer, more subtle thing as it's opened to much more progressively and slowly. And you mentioned like the psychedelics, right? As far as I know, the traditions that use them would actually spend a long time preparing the person, not just like find them first time they're meeting, cool, let's go on a trip, blow the whole mind open and see what happens from there. And I'm seeing more and more of this same like speeding through the veil that's getting more popular. Here in Australia, they've got this holotropic breath work where you basically just hyperventilate until you trip out, and it's doing something similar, right? It's just bringing an enormous amount of stirring up the depths until it like bubbles out the top, and people get a bit hooked on that. So yeah, maybe can you talk to your experience of how you grounded all that excess that you brought in and tempered it and made it structured and so on?
yeah, sure. I'll add one small thing though, to what you were saying, which is interesting. I think, well, about indigenous people and like the process that they went through, and then I'll talk about if that's okay, and then I'll.
Please, please.
Um, One is that I think in general, most indigenous people who literally like live in an indigenous context have a lot more zheng. And so by their very nature, they're a lot more like stable and grounded, like physically, and they have more sturdy physical structures. Of course, yeah, and then their systems are way more open than ours, right? Because they are in nature and they're tuning to the natural world, and that's the world that they grew up in already. So, they're already processing more information just like from day one, right? They're not as tense and as tight as we are. They come from healthy ancestral lines, so there's not like all of this like ancestral static in. And then, I mean, in some ways they're so like already stable that they have to do sometimes like super intense stuff for days and days and days on end just to get some movement happening. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Um, in some situations, right? Like some of the bigger rituals that would happen less often, like a Sundance, for example, or you've ever heard of like the Lakota Sundance,
Mhm.
where people yeah, I mean, it's just some of the stuff that they did was so utterly intense because they were already so grounded and rooted and stable and open and yin that like that's what they needed, right? It's really, and they were, and then they were able to manage that and bring it into context again because they had all these structures to support them in restabilizing afterward, right? So it's really interesting, like to see the contrast of like what their systems were able to handle versus like what our systems are able to handle healthfully, right? Um, yeah. So yeah. So then my own experience, right? Well, so um, is this still an ongoing thing, right? I'm still at this stage, still figuring out where there's like little blockages or where there are certain leaks of energy or where there's too much energy in the system. And I'm still finding ways to ground and stabilize it. I mean, compared to where I was 17 years ago, I mean, I'm eons beyond that, right? And you know, at that time, I would do like a 1 hour yoga session, and I felt like the stars had blown open. That's how much like energy there was in my system. And now I can practice for, hours and hours a day and I'm fine. So there's been a big shift, but it's an ongoing learning process. I tend to still have just a lot of juice in my system, right? That needs to be grounded and stabilized and smoothed out. It didn't help that I experienced a lot of physical damage when I was living at the wolf sanctuary, right? Because I had a job, even when I was going through all of that, I still had a very physical job that was very intense, and my constitution is not overtly like physically super sturdy, right? It's one that I've had to like, so I took a lot of damage and it created a lot of like tissue blocks in my system that I'm still dealing with. So I would put that out there, right? That there's just been a lot of like physical trauma that that has been something I've had to deal with. But setting all that aside, I will say that I wished I had the type of skill set that you're teaching when I was going through what I was going through, right? So a lot of the things have gone back to the principles that are taught within Taoism. To be honest, it's been the most influential way of orientating to me. So that would be, I mean, obviously the basic things matter. It's eating a very nourishing diet, right? And so a nourishing diet can mean many things for many different people, but you want dense foods that things like, if you eat meat, things like meat, things that, that feed the blood, right? So that the blood can help keep everything, keep all of this energetic movement in the system that's happening more stable, because I'm guessing there's something that, maybe some of your people might be exposed to is those basic aspects of like Chinese medicine, right? Right, so we're eating a very nourishing diet, opening as much of the body as possible, right? And I mean everything that you can open. Like for me, I've had to open it, right? So I mean that means working on my eyes, on my tongue, on my face, on my head, on my neck, on my torso, limbs, the belly, the pelvis, the legs, everything, right? So doing work in some way or another that works these tissues and opens them and de-armors them and removes uh, blockages in the flow of energy. Work around syncing, right? So being able to sync and root the chi downward has been super, super, super helpful. So things like for me, Tai Chi has been very helpful in that way. Finding ways to create smoothness of energy flow has been really important for me personally, which has been more of a quality of consciousness. It's how my consciousness relates to the flow of energy through the system, so that it's not reactive, it's not too willful, it's not too constricting, it's not too flighty, but that it relates to the energy in a way that it creates smoothness. Has been an enormous thing for me personally. Stretching, right? And stretching open the tissues to release heat from the system. Because one of the things that I experienced for a long time was a ton of heat. Um, Being able to then deal with the emotional and mental and spiritual blocks that are mapped onto whatever's going on in my system. So, I mean, sometimes I'll do a bunch of work and I don't feel anything on those levels. And then some days it's like, whoa, all of a sudden there's a ton of emotional content in my system, or I feel like I got hit by a truck. And that truck I can tell is energetic. And I have to like dissolve something in my system, or even a personality structure, right? Some identity that I have that simply has to die and be reborn differently. Um, so having a skill set around around all of those types of things, right? Opening the body and opening every part of the body, making sure that the tissues are healthy as much as possible, learning to ground and sync the energy, um, learning how to manage, how to deal with energy in general, then being able to release the blocks on mental, emotional, and spiritual levels that are tied into these physical aspects and mirror on these other, like, they're all like connected. They're like pieces. They're like parts of a bandwidth, like a spectrum. They're all like connected together, and so um, and then doing that over and over and over again, and learning from my mistakes. And going through some, I would say, through some really intense experiences that have been sometimes brutal, like brutal, and what I've had to like let go of, because it's very interesting. Because for me, right? So let's say I have to open my body as much as anyone at this point, right? I have to.
Mm.
If I don't, it just it turns into a shit show. But because I already have so much energy moving through my system, sometimes just basic releases are super intense, right? Like it's just, and there's no way around it. It's like, it's either I don't release it because I have to move so slow that it just won't ever happen, or I just have to let it do its thing, right? And it's just creates these big discharges of energy that create spontaneous movement, and that's just like a part of my existence. It's like, and the more that I do that, the smoother things get, the more capacity I have, the healthier I am, etc. One of the things that has started to make a huge difference is actually cultivating the lower Dantian through the methodology that you taught me. Even though I had been working with the lower Dantian for a really long time, I realized that more so I was just kind of stimulating it
Mhm.
instead of really building it, which are two very different things. And so, when you build a very strong lower dantian, you create a powerful magnetic field in the lower parts of the body that is capable of drawing towards it all of this excess energy and containing it, and if anything, using it for physical vitality. When you don't have a strong lower dantian, the energy will tend to pull towards one of the stronger other centers in the body, which are the heart and the head,
Yeah,
right?
usually the head.
And yeah. And for me, one of the big things that I had to deal with was the energy getting strongly stuck in my heart. So much so that I would say that I had, heart disease in some way or another for years, because the energy would literally get stuck, and inside my chest, the nerves that would go to my heart would like vibrate and pulsate, and the energy would just get stuck in my heart. It would go up, and it was just, oh my god, and it would create palpitations, and just it was a brutal time, when the energy got stuck there. So a big thing that I've had to do is learn to open the flow of energy into the arms and shoulders and hands, and then open my heart more and more and more, and learn to pull the energy away from that part of the body, as well. So it's been an interesting ride, man. And at this stage, it's there's there's no like stopping for me, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
no, it's not like I can put it on holiday because I just no, it's like this is like who I am. I have to. I mean, have to is a strong word. I've grown to love all of my practices, right? Like I love practice, but at the same time, you know, ratcheting it back from love behind. There's also like have to, you know, because there is just so much energy in my system, um, all the time. You know, um, and a lot of energy relative to me. And I'm not
Mhm,
trying to say like I have a lot of chi compared to anyone else, right? It's
mhm,
like
mhm.
my experience of it is that there's a ton of fucking chi in my system, and maybe that's just my experience.
Yeah, yeah. And
Um,
if you don't take care, it starts to mess up your life, right?
Yeah, hard and fast. And so a lot of the skills that have been helpful are really for me the classical Taoist training that you would
Mhm.
see um, in Taoist traditions, right? Like
Yeah.
those things have made the biggest difference for me. I've played with the yogic traditions. I've done a lot of stuff from that part of the world, from India, that has never done for me personally what the Taoist traditions have done. Um, that's not to say that those traditions wouldn't be helpful for somebody else, but
Mhm.
for me, Taoism just has such an organic and, dare I say, natural. I know that's a really funky word to use, right? But a very organic, natural process for helping the energy circulate and be grounded in very smooth ways that allow you to remain a functional human being in the world. If anything, increase your function in certain respects.
Yeah.
Um,
While also
yeah.
progressively entertaining more and more energy, right? And more of this
Yes.
information and details and more porosity with the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this
So
is
that's what I've had. Sorry.
maybe we can wrap this up just with a little thing that I want you to let people know kind of what a day in the training life of Ramon looks like. But before we get there, just to like kind of re-explain what you said already, right? Because I think it'll be helpful for a lot of people to realize. I see the very common kind of yin yang balance thing is I've got my meditation, I've got maybe my ritual visualization practices, whatever they may be, things like this. And then I've got my physical hard training. I'm going to lift weights and do movementing stuff, stretching, strength, and that, and maybe some nature time thrown in. And there's like a little bit of a lot of a difference between either of those realms and the internal Dantian work you're talking about that's presented in Taoism and good classical yoga if you can find it in the haystack that is modern yoga of, most modern yoga is essentially just physical exercise. It's just stretching with a bit of breathing.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with it, but it's not doing the same thing, right? So this physical side, what I found in my observations over and over again is the people who are naturally porous, who are naturally more open to the world and the subtle movements of energy and the vast amount of energy and the chaos of that energy, those people um, were inclined towards the more spiritual practices, right? They get drawn like moths to a flame to more of that, more of the same. Let's just do more visual meditations, more energetic things. And it's like, no, 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 you need to like condense down. The physical practices can do that to a degree. But like you mentioned, they can also, you can just burn yourself out equally as easy just doing too much physical stuff like you were talking about in the when you were working in the wolf sanctuary and just very physically traumatized body. And so I see the same thing, people with kind of like twisted, distorted bodies that are maybe very strong and can maybe do some pretty um skillful physical things, but it's not the same flavor as the internal stuff that comes from Taoism, where you actually get beyond that superficial layer of tension and into the deeper tensions of like the organ and the, the lower abdominal cavity. And, you start to bring pressure and energy and everything else down into those areas. And from my perspective, that's the grounding. That's the yang of the mind actually starting to meet the yin of the body in a really deep, deep foundational way that doesn't necessarily happen with just pure physical training, right? It's good. I still heartily recommend everyone do some good old fashioned, just get out there and sweat a bit and work a bit. Um, but this kind of grounding in the interior spaces is something kind of special, and over again I see it being the kind of little missing key that brings a lot of grounding to people who are naturally porous and naturally subject to these like chaotic energies of the world that are going around, more so than physical training. Um, so I just wanted to kind of highlight that for the listeners because it was wound through Ramon's tail there, but to have it kind of just a bit more obvious is always a good thing, I find. The other thing I wanted to do is, yeah, just get a bit of a taste of what your training looks like these days. What take us just through a rough example of a day or a week in the life of Ramon's training. You're doing some meditation. You're obviously doing the Dantian, Neigong kind of stuff. Um, yeah, what's what?
Yeah. Uh, by the way, I love obvious, so thank you for doing that. Yeah.
Cool.
Sometimes I ramble, man. Yeah. The so like yeah. A day for me might start when I wake up in bed, right? So the first thing I'll typically do is something like 5 to 10 minutes of some kind of very soft abdominal breathing, and then typically I'll do some kind of like opening of the heart. So it might be like the inner smile meditation. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. Not like the full. It's a Taoist practice for certain Taoist traditions, anyway.
I've
It's
heard
just
versions of it. Don't know if it's the same.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and then I may do like a gratitude practice or something like that, right? And typically when I'm doing that, I'm very also focused in on being present inside the body and really, really settling deeply into the energy that's created by the emotions, right? And just continuing to breathe and just be soft about that, you know? Then I'll wake up, and I'll get put, coffee to boil and things like that, and then typically I'll do another, like, short meditative practice for, like, 15 or 20 minutes. It could be anything from, like, anchoring the breath or watching the breath or something like that, right? Some kind of mindfulness process.
Mhm.
Depends on which cycle I'm in terms of training. At other times, it was the more like a primordial alchemy, meditative, energetic process. Like, and I would just do like something really simple just to open up those layers of energetic awareness. But right now, I'm really, really focused on physical experience. Um, and then I'll have coffee and I'll talk to my wife and I'll do that sort of thing in the morning, and then I'll get started with probably like 2 hours, something like that, of training. And so that could include um, so internal martial arts like Tai Chi or Xingyi, eight extraordinary vessel qigong of some form or another. Maybe which the system that I practice was taught to me by my teacher Teo Semko, and it's kind of broad and spontaneous, but it does have like a larger structure built into it where you're working with each of the extraordinary vessels in a way that kind of looks movement focused, but is working with the underlying core architecture of how you experience life through them.
Mhm.
Um, and then or maybe like the five animal frolics or something like that, or maybe some other kind of internal martial art adjunct work, so things that aid the type of strength that's required in the internal martial arts to work well. um, then maybe microcosmic orbit work that's a bit more like qigong, movement orientated, or well, I guess it depends on. Let me not get into that. So I'll just say that I could just start going off into the details that aren't required. I was going to say that the microcosmic orbit is a part of the extraordinary vessels, but it's I have different methods for doing different things at different times.
Yeah.
um, and maybe standing practice or something like that. On occasion, I'll do and on occasion, I mean a couple times a week, I'll do more like a very Soaz Dao Yin type of focused work, or working with like the Wing Chun metal ring type of exercises
Mhm.
to work on the shoulders, elbows, hands, and wrists. Maybe stuff from Bagua to open up the shoulders and the arms too. So yeah, I mean, just it's all that type of stuff, right? And I'm very spontaneous about it. In terms of I follow the thread of what wants to emerge in that moment, and I'll literally let the whole physical practice typically evolve that way. So because everything I'm doing is feeding into everything else, I find that I can continue to make progress with all of these different arts, even though I'm not working specifically with every art every day. They're all feeding into each other in a way that's really coherent. And so I just do what wants to emerge, and that's typically for about like 75 minutes. Then 60 to 75 minutes, depending on the day, sometimes an hour and a half, 90 minutes if I'm like really in it. And it's some combination of all those things, Qigong, internal martial arts, standing work, and opening the physical body, and stretching, shaking, and vibrating, all that stuff. Then I'll sit into meditation, or just seated Qigong work, right? And again, it depends on what cycle I'm in. Right now, I'm in a cycle where I'm very focused on ting, right? On ting skills and just listening and just guiding the energy flow with my hands. And so that might be doing a particular type of qigong that revolves around an organ. It could be sinking more deeply into my central channel. It could be lower dantian cultivation. It could be anchoring the breath or sitting and forgetting practice,
Mhm.
or something along those lines. And that will typically last anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour, something like that. Depending on the day, I might also then afterwards do like an oil massage, like an Ayurvedic oil massage, and then shower later in the day. I'll typically do some kind of heart opening qigong practice that I have put together over many years of acquiring different skill
Mhm.
sets. So it's really thorough. Um, and but it only takes about 15, 20 minutes. And then depending on how I'm doing, I might meditate again in the evening, for 20 minutes. So I mean, that's like more or less my day. I mean, I spend time in nature too. So when I'm in nature, I'm generally very attuned to that process. And yeah, I mean, I have other parts of my practice that I won't necessarily like discuss at the moment because they don't seem relevant to this. Um, but yeah, that's about like a typical day for me. At this point. Yeah.
It's a decent amount of hours being sunk into the cultivation. Now, that's super cool.
Yeah. I there was a time where I literally could not do that much. So um even just like 5 years ago, like, that amount of practice would have been like I just can't, because
Mhm.
it would just kick up too much stuff, too much movement, too much blockage. And now it feels like that's just about right. Like I really don't feel like I need more. Like I don't feel like I need to build up more from where I'm at. Like I feel at this point the volume is good. It's just depth that I would like to continue to increase, right, over time.
It'll come. It'll come. Cool, man. I think that's a really nice place to kind of wrap things up. So just to finish up, are you doing any public teaching or anything at the moment? And you've got your books coming out. Just do a bit of a plug for whatever you've got public available.
Sure. Well, so the first book I wrote is called The Ancestral Now, the intersection between deep time, primal movement, nutrition, and magic and ancestral consciousness. Right. So it's quite the title, but you can find it on Amazon with just the Ancestral Now. If you're searching under the books category, and yeah, I'm writing another. Well, another book is going to be published that I wrote called In Praise of the Wild Spirit. The subtitle, I'm still working on that, but something like "Rewilding 21st Century Humans" or something along those lines, right?
Nice.
I'm still working on a subtitle, but it'll be something simple and straightforward. And that should be out sometime this year. Just waiting for my wife to finish editing it. And at the moment, my primary hub online is the Ancestral Now .substack.com. Um, and I'm currently on sabbatical, so I'm not creating there, but at some point I will. Though honestly, I suspect that when I return to teaching, it's going to take on somewhat of a different orientation and flavor.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I think it's going to be I don't wanna, like, say it too soon, but I suspect it's gonna revolve more around, just straightforward cultivation, and the intersection between cultivation, health, and healing, and spirituality, and where all those things link. That's probably gonna be what's gonna happen. But that's still gestating, in my conception vessel, so we'll see how that goes, yeah. I had to do that, yeah. Um That's yeah, so
Cool, man. So I'll throw all those links in the show notes for people to follow up if they want to. And I think we'll call it a day there. Thanks heaps for coming on. It's been always wonderful to chat, and every single time we've done a couple of big off the record chats like this, and also I've been on your podcast, your old podcast at one point. So I always learn something new from you every time we connect, which is fantastic, and I'm looking forward to more.
awesome, man. Yeah, it's a pleasure connecting with you. I really value our friendship, man, and I've learned a lot from you too. I just today I did leg awakening. I did the old leg
Nice.
awakening practice. Yeah, for example, and then
Yep. I have the 2025 edition of that coming very, very soon. Whenever I get around to recording it, and I've got a to-do list that's way too long at the moment, but I'll get there. Yeah, and I can show you some of that stuff before it even goes live. It's been great. So yeah, looks forward to sharing that with you, and of course all the listeners. For anyone who's wanting to get into my stuff, the podcast, of course, is the kind of most fun thing I'm doing at the moment. I really love recording these. They're coming out every fortnight or so, and otherwise, I've got online courses. I've got a Patreon running at the moment. It's patreon.com/aware relaxed connected, where you can do practices of the week there. So if you're interested in any of the kind of internal stuff Ramon was talking about, you can just kind of tune in, and each week I do something a little bit different. It follows a rough theme, but it can bounce around a bit too if I feel drawn in a particular direction. And otherwise, just jump on my website, send me a message, and I'll put you in touch with all the other stuff I do. Thanks, Ramon. Thanks for coming on, and I'm sure you'll be on again soon. Maybe we can dive more into specific topics now that we've done the big overview.
okay, cool. It's been great being here, Greg.